What if the first civilization was not the first? The history we learned says everything began there. Hunters became farmers, villages became cities, and then writing, temples, civilization emerged. The problem is that not everything found there follows this order. In Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization, archaeologists found layers that should not exist. Cities appearing already complex, temples with no primitive phase, advanced knowledge emerging with no visible beginning. This does not present itself as a simple start. It shows signs of something already in operation. The Sumerian texts themselves speak of a previous world, a time before the flood, before the rupture, before the reconstruction. And this creates a problem that traditional chronology has never resolved. What existed before what we call the first civilization? For decades, the origin of civilization was told as a clear, almost didactic sequence, a logical chain that appeared to leave no room for doubt. First, small human groups, nomadic, surviving through hunting and gathering. Then, the discovery of agriculture. Cultivation anchored people to the land. The land gave rise to villages. Villages grew. Cities emerged. And with them came writing, temples, social organization, but what we call civilization. This narrative is not merely popular. It is comfortable. It explains everything with order, and order conveys security. Seen this way, the past appears predictable. Each stage prepares the next. Nothing emerges before its time. Nothing appears too complete too early. Everything evolves. For a long time, Mesopotamia was placed precisely at this point in history, the place where this sequence was believed to have worked perfectly. The region between the Tigris and the Euphrates was presented as the ideal setting. Predictable rivers, fertile soils, abundant agriculture, gradual growth. The cradle. But the problem begins when this story is confronted with what was actually found there. When archaeologists began excavating the deepest layers of Mesopotamia, they expected to find exactly what the narrative predicted. Simple settlements, rudimentary structures, clear signs of a slow transition from the primitive to the complex. What emerged was something else. Instead of incipient villages, planned cities appeared. Instead of improvised temples, monumental structures emerged. Instead of social experimentation, organized systems were already in place. All of this appears far too early for a gradual beginning. That alone would already be strange. But it was not an isolated case. The pattern repeated itself across different excavation sites over decades. The deeper researchers dug, the less primitive the past seemed. Writing does not appear as an initial stumble. Architecture does not emerge as a tentative attempt. Religious organization does not present itself as a rehearsal. It is already there, functioning. And this creates a silent friction with the linear history we were taught. Because civilizations do not usually arrive fully formed. When we observe other human societies, we see clear traces of transition, confusing phases, abandoned attempts, poorly resolved structures, errors, adjustments. The path from the simple to the complex usually leaves marks. In Mesopotamia, those marks do not appear with the expected clarity. What appears is continuity, and, more unsettling still, Signs of reconstruction. The oldest records found in the region do not speak of an absolute beginning. They speak of restoration, of return, of something that was interrupted. The Sumerian texts describe kings who descended from the heavens after a great event. They speak of cities that existed before a great rupture, not as distant myth, but as structuring memory. This is not the language of foundation. It is the language of resumption. This does not mean these texts are recounting a literal story in the modern sense, but it does indicate that for those who wrote them, the world was not simply beginning there. Something had been lost. Something had been erased. And here, the first real point of tension emerges. If Mesopotamia was the beginning, why does its own earliest memory point to something earlier? If it was a birth, why is the discourse one of return? Archaeology, curiously, does not resolve this tension. It deepens it. Sedimentary layers indicate abrupt interruptions, sudden changes in human occupation. Cities abandoned and centuries later rebuilt almost in the same place, with knowledge preserved. There is no clear void between the before and the after. There is broken continuity. This is difficult to fit into a narrative of continuous progress. And it is precisely here that the comfortable history begins to fail. Because if we accept that civilization was born there gradually, we need to explain why its earliest records already speak of something prior. We need to explain why its oldest structures already display a level of sophistication that would normally require centuries of visible development. We need to explain why the beginning looks so much like a middle. This chapter does not resolve these questions. It merely establishes the problem. Mesopotamia was long presented as point zero. But when we look closely, signs emerge that the story there may not have begun from nothing. And that shifts the question. If the cradle is not as simple as it seems, then the question ceases to be how did everything begin there, and becomes something else, far more uncomfortable. What happened before, for it to appear already reconstructed when it re-emerged? In the next step, we need to look not at what history claims, but at what it fails to explain. When archaeological excavations are discussed, the common image is that of a staircase into the past. Each layer removed would lead to a phase that is older, simpler, closer to a rudimentary beginning. This is how most human histories present themselves when carefully excavated. In Mesopotamia, this logic does not hold for long. As the deeper levels began to be reached, what appeared was not a confused past struggling to organize itself. What emerged were structures far too complete for an initial stage. Urban planning, clear division of functions, architecture designed to endure. There was no sign of the improvisation typical of a beginning. At several excavated sites, the oldest temples already occupy central and elevated positions, as if the space had been organized around them from the very start of occupation. This is not common in embryonic settlements. Normally, the sacred grows gradually alongside social complexity. Here, it is already established. The same is true of administration. Early records do not show a society testing forms of control. They already operate with systems, measures, records, hierarchies. Writing appears not as an experiment, but as a functional tool. This set of signs raises an uncomfortable question. Where are the attempts? If civilization were being born there, one would expect to find traces of error. Intermediate phases, abandoned solutions, structures rebuilt multiple times before they worked. But what is seen is technical continuity, interrupted only by abrupt events. Sedimentary layers indicate periods in which human occupation was suddenly interrupted. Not a slow abandonment, not a gradual decline. Something that forced the interruption. And when occupation returns, knowledge returns with it. This is crucial, because technical knowledge does not usually survive long population gaps intact. It is lost, fragmented, and must be relearned. In Mesopotamia, the resumption does not begin from zero. It resumes from an advanced point, not as simple invention, as reorganization of what had already worked. It is at this point that the traditional narrative begins to strain. If there was an interval, why was the return not primitive? If there was a rupture, why does organization reappear so quickly? Some archaeologists treat this as geographical coincidence, others as cultural acceleration. But these explanations do not resolve the whole. They explain parts, not the pattern. Because the pattern is not only technical, it is also symbolic. The oldest records do not celebrate the foundation of a new world. They speak of order being restored, of cities being re-established, of kings assuming functions that already existed before them. The language does not point to discovery, it points to inheritance. This does not, by itself, demonstrate the existence of a fully defined earlier civilization. But it does indicate that for those who lived there, the world was not simply beginning. It was being reorganized after something had broken its continuity. And this coincides, uncomfortably, with what the land reveals: interruptions, rapid returns, preserved complexity. None of this fits well with the idea of a gradual birth. What emerges from ancient Mesopotamia is not a clean upward line. It is a fractured surface, marked by signs of something that was interrupted and resumed, without all the stages of the process remaining visible. And this forces us to look at the region differently, not merely as the place where everything began, but as the place where something reappeared after having been lost. This shifts the question. The issue ceases to be purely archaeological. It comes to involve history and memory. Because if there was a before, it did not disappear without leaving traces. It left marks in the ground, and it left echoes in the texts. In the next step, we need to observe this ancient memory carefully, not as a comfortable myth, but as part of a problem that has yet to be resolved. When we bring together everything that has been examined so far, the prevailing feeling is not one of discovery, but of discomfort. Mesopotamia remains a central point in human history. That does not change. What changes is the certainty with which it can be called a beginning. The land does not tell a simple story. The texts do not speak as if inaugurating something new. And the data do not align with the sequence we learn to repeat. None of this, taken in isolation, overturns an entire chronology, but together it creates a persistent noise. A noise that does not fade with quick explanations, nor with the repetition of the traditional narrative. Because the central issue is not to prove that a fully mapped earlier civilization existed. The problem is more basic. It is to explain why, in the very place where everything should be beginning, so much already appears to be in operation. It is to explain why the beginning looks so much like continuation. Throughout history, societies usually leave clear traces of learning. Trials, attempts, failures, discarded paths. Ancient Mesopotamia, however, appears as if it were resuming something it already knew. As if it were rebuilding upon foundations that we can no longer see with clarity. This does not point to a definitive answer. It points to a gap. And gaps matter. They suggest that what we know may be only the preserved portion of history. That which managed to pass through ruptures, disasters, erasures. What was left out may not have been less important. It may simply have been less durable. The peoples of Mesopotamia themselves seemed aware of this. Their oldest texts do not speak of a newly created world. They speak of order being restored, of cities being raised again, of a past that was not fully accessible, but was still remembered, not as nostalgia, as reference. This creates a curious impasse. On one side, we have modern chronology, organized, coherent, didactic. On the other, we have data and memories that do not fit neatly into it, yet cannot be ignored. Between the two, the real problem emerges. The question ceases to be simply, where did civilization begin? It becomes, what was lost before, what we managed to record? Because human history is not written only by what is born. It is also shaped by what disappears. And Mesopotamia, rather than being merely the starting point, may be the place where this loss became most visible. Where reconstruction left enough marks to force us to reconsider what we call a beginning. This does not close the subject. It offers no comfortable answer. But it leaves a problem far too clear to be ignored. A problem that remains buried, not only beneath the ground, but beneath the way we choose to tell our own origin.